Welcome. Let's go back to 1952. This is the time which, according to conservatives, or according to the imagination of conservatives, must have been a golden era. Men are wearing very cool suits. They have families. The women are dressed in a feminine way. They have this beautiful house with the white fence. The kids are running around. They smoke Lucky Strikes. And it's the epitome of the American dream and of capitalism, and there's no cloud in the horizon. And yet at that year, a very bright mind, a conservative sociologist, if you ever believe that such a thing could exist, gives his warning. He says, there's a very, very dangerous trend going on in society in the last decades, if not centuries, because we see two very important institutions going in different directions. We see the institution of the communities being more and more and more in a decline of their importance and of their role in life. And we see the institution of the state taking their position. Now you would say, I've heard this 1 million times. Why do I need to hear this again? Well, I think it's important to listen to this again, because today we're going to talk about the thought of Robert Nisbet, who, as I said, is a conservative sociologist, but he's not your usual conservative. And he's someone who has very, very interesting views, and particularly on one topic that I think needs to be discussed more within objectivist circles. And this topic is the issue of the community. What is the role of the community and how it is potentially a vehicle for freedom or for human flourishing? Now, quite often, we in the objectivist universe, we're a bit skeptical to the idea of the community. We say, wait, isn't this related to these parochial structures? Isn't this related to a society mostly of stasis, that you're tied to those around you? And in a way, you haven't even chosen them. And the answer is, at one level, yes, but also there's something more to communities which I want to examine. So let me say, first of all, something very short about Nisbet. Nisbet used to be considered part of the canon in sociology. There was a time where conservatives could be included in a sociological curriculum. And actually, there was a time that a conservative could be the chairman of sociology in the University of Berkeley. Today, not even a Marxist would be able to be the chairman of sociology at Berkeley, because he would not be progressive enough. But there was a time that the conservative could hold that position. How different these times were. And he was a respectable conservative. Then he left academia and he worked for the American Enterprise Institute. Ronald Reagan had him in high esteem in the 80s. And yet again, he was someone who was not your typical conservative. So, for example, he had very, very interesting views on abortion. He was not in favor of the state banning abortion, and he was not following the conservative line on everything. So I think it's a person who deserves to be remembered, and his ideas need to be brought on the table, because we might find something useful in them. So in 1952, Nisbet writes this very important book, which is called The Quest for Community. And as you can tell from the title, he's worried about what is happening to the institutions, let's say, of communities. So he says, look, what do most conservatives tell you? They tell you that the reason behind the retreat of communities and of institutions such as the family, the church, the guild, or the village, or whatever, is technology, the Industrial Revolution, science. Nisbet said, forget all this. These people are boring. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to tell you what is behind the retreat of communities, the retreat of these almost organic, voluntary associations of people. What is behind the retreat is the state. And he characterizes the state as a permanent revolution. Remember, Trotsky talked about he envisioned the permanent revolution, which means a revolution that all the time would gain ground, that would go deeper and deeper and deeper in society. And Nisbet says, actually, not only the communist state, but any state is doing this. The state is grasping more and more aspects of our life. And he makes a historical, let's say, overview. And he says, look, the state begins as an instrument mostly of war or as an instrument of policing. And now we see the state being present in every part of your life, being present in everything that has to do with human interaction. And we find ourselves, he says, in the tragic situation where state and society have become synonymous. And of course, we see this today so often with the leftists. When you question the state, they will say, wait, you don't believe in society? Or they give this stupid thing that, oh, Margaret Thatcher did not believe in society because she believed in the individuals, which actually it's the exact opposite. Thatcher said there is no society without individuals, basically. But the leftists translated it, there is no society. So this is Nisbet's, let's say, big historical conclusion, and we're going to see how he reached this conclusion. So he says, look, a state bureaucrat today has a say on more aspects on one's life than a king had in the 16th century, for example. And here he reminds us a bit Hans Hermann Hoppe, who said exactly the same thing, that democracy, although you might think you have more freedom, more aspects of your life are under the auspices of the state. So, for example, things such as education or your health, or even how you socialize yourself are today under the prism of the state. And Nisbet recognizes that, of course, the state has given us liberties. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of the nation state, of course, has thrown away tyrannies of ages. But at the same time, they have established new areas of control. And how has this been achieved? Has this been achieved by brute force? No, he says. And here is the very interesting thing, that the state in a way wants you to give it more power. And here he explains it. So what is the lure? What is the way the state lures you in? How is the way the state makes itself more attractive to you? And he says, quote, it has to do, by the way, with the idea that you are a part of it. It has to go with the idea that with democracy and with mass participation, you have more power. So he says, quote, this conception of mass participation in power, with its corollary of mass power as mass freedom, has proved to be the most revolutionary of all political doctrines in the modern world. If the power of government is but the reflection of the will of the masses, then does it not follow that every increase in governmental authority, even increase of political authority, is ex hypothesis an increase in real freedom for the people? So Nisbet says this is the trap that you people have fallen in. You think that by giving more power to the state through the vehicle of democracy, you get more power yourself. But you couldn't be more wrong. So, and in this way, he reminds us a bit of Thomas Jefferson, who says the state with the power to do things for people has also the power to do things to people. So, and here he's also making a very strong criticism of Rousseau. So I would tell you, if you want a good smacking of Rousseau, go read Nisbet. He's one of the best critics who completely sees Rousseau, the essence of his argument, for what it is. This idea of democracy as, you know, go beyond yourself, power to the people. You find yourself through the power to the masses. So, where would Nisbet disagree, let's say, with an objectivist? Nisbet would say, look, the biggest conflict is not the state versus individuals. So you individualists, Nisbet would say, you're wrong. The biggest conflict is the state versus what he calls the intermediate institutions, or in simple words, communities. So again, what kind of communities? The family, the extended family, the neighborhood, the apprentice, the guild, the church. And what are the characteristics of these communities? He says these communities are rising organically, and they're based on authority. Authority is not the same as naked power. authority in a way is earned, and authority is based on personal relationships. Often he says it's based on friendship. And authority provides a constraint, provides a perimeter, is the kernel through which you come into contact with the world, through which you find what is good and what is bad, what is okay and what is not okay. Authority, however, is quite comfortable also with diversity. So, for example, you don't like this social status, you don't like this community, you can go to another community. You don't like this particular religious dogma, for example, you can look for something else. But this is not the same, says Nisbet, with power. So he says, don't confuse authority, the authority of the voluntary association, with power. Power, he says, comes imposed from above. And power only flourishes when authority, when these institutions of voluntary cooperation become weaker. And there's one more difference. Power is not happy with diversity. Power wants to be homogeneous. Power doesn't like any competition. So this is his main idea of this is the main idea of the difference between communities and state power. So let me take a second and see what we have on the chat. What are the key communities, says Marilyn, the key difference between communities and tribes? That's a very good question. So for Nisbet, a community doesn't have to take over your life. So for example, a tribe is almost something that has a say in everything in your life, how you see the world. A community for Nisbet would be, let's say, your trade union, or it could be your mutual support society, which back in the day used to be something like the precursor of the welfare state. So a community is something where you can still be an individual with your own judgment, but here's the important thing. It covers a need, and not an existential need necessarily, not a need of, where I am in the world without it. It covers a practical need. And here, says Nisbet, is the viciousness of the state. The state, he says, is a bit like this psychopathic boyfriend who says, oh, I'm here for you. I'm going to take over everything. I'm going to help you with everything. You don't need your friends. You don't need your family. I'm here for you. And in a way, before you understand, he cuts you off from everything. And now he basically owes your life. So why do communities become obsolete? And Nisbet here has a very, very unique understanding. He says, quote, people do not come together in significant and lasting associations merely to be together. They come together to do something that cannot easily be done in individual association. Now you notice that when almost every aspect of your life is taken over by the state, then why have communities? Why have these voluntary associations? And Nisbet says, here's the catch though, these voluntary associations are also your defense against the state. Without them, the state becomes even more imperialistic, and this permanent revolution of the state goes on and on and on and on. And this is where we find ourselves today. And he gives some interesting historical examples. What do the Nazis do when they come to power? They ban, or the fascists, they ban all trade unions. What do the Soviets do in the 30s? What is Stalin's key decision? The key collectivization of land. What does this mean? No more farms run by families or by you and your 3 people around you in the village. No, collective farming. What do you say? You don't want to do it? Or, oh, do I see that this village there, people are way too tied together? Take them and send them, each one to the different sides of the Soviet Union, to the different sides of the steppes, thousands of miles apart. They don't have to be together. And he actually goes back to the French Revolution. And there's something very, very interesting here where he talks about the lawmaker in the French Revolution and why they banned the guilds. Quote, here's the revolutionary lawmaker. There is no longer any corporation within the state. There is but the particular interest of each individual and the general interest of the state. So basically, he tells you there shouldn't be any intermediary, no intermediate institution. It's you and the state. You don't need anything else. Or something even more, understand how cynical they are, the Jacobins. So here he talks about why they banned charities in the French Revolution. And again, the French lawmaker says, quote, "A state that is truly free ought not to suffer within its bosom any association, not even such as being dedicated to public improvement has merited well of the country." No, you don't need any associations. The one association, the one group you belong is the state. It's either this or nothing else. So we see this displacement, says Nisbet, where aspects of your life where you would figure them out through your voluntary interaction with others now are taken over by the state. And here's again why Nisbet is interesting. He says to his fellow conservatives, don't be fooled by nationalism. Don't think that, oh, the nation is my community. He says, no, what has happened with nationalism is that you leave behind your other bonds, your other allegiances, and you form one big allegiance to people that you don't know, you don't come together voluntarily, you don't have much in common, and your whole purpose now is to serve the state. Well done. This is what you have managed to accomplish, nationalist. So where does the individual lie into all this? Where do we find the individual? So Nisbet says, look, I'm not against individualism. I understand that this idea of the individual in the Industrial Revolution as this capable agent, again, it has been used as, it was basically a trap, he says. Because if you see around you today, you don't see strong individuals, he says. He says, instead of the free individual, you see the lost individual. Instead of independence, you see isolation. And these are not the same things, he says. Instead of self-discovery, you see self-obsession. And the guy wrote in the 50s and the 60s. No social media then, no. So he foresees these things decades ago. And he says, instead of the individual, the conqueror, you see the individual who just waits to be conquered. Imagine if Nisbet was around during this pandemic. So he says the loss of community creates this existential terror, this existential angst. And this, he says, leads to a neurosis. Basically leads to psychological trauma. And he says here is the big contradiction. And the big contradiction is that, quote, man's belief in himself has become weakest in the very age when his control on environment is greatest. So he says, although we have conquered nature, for some reason, now we feel weaker than ever. And this is, again, something which he spots the right thing, maybe not for exactly the same reasons as, let's say, Rand would see the phenomenon, but he spots the right thing. He spots the right things that are actually wrong in society. So what are some other problems with the loss of communities? So Nisbet, in a way, is doing the work that later would be done by Jordan Peterson. He spots the problem in how do you take someone, let's say a young man, what is the rite of passage today? How do you communicate to someone what it means to be part of this society, what it means to grow up, what it means to be an adult? And he says, unfortunately, this is not happening. But how did it used to happen? And he says, these are ties, these certain bonds which themselves would reach from past to future. These ties have become weak and make the problem of coming to adulthood so widely painful and baffling. Again, the guy writes more than half a century earlier. How, apart from stable ties with preceding generations, can the image of adulthood be kept clear in society? And again, how relevant is this today when we're completely estranged from the past? You see the young generation tearing down statuses. The idea is that the past is, oh, these people who were racist, and there is no past. There's only a future, which is an utopia, which we are going to gain by asking for more and more and more power. And here we go to the last example of the last incidents of state expansion. And now we're at some point in the 70s, so we leave behind the question of communities. And he says there is a new tool that the Goliath, that is the state, uses in its imperialistic expansion. And this is its quest against inequality. So basically, before Yaron Brook and Don Watkins, one of the best attacks on inequality one of the best attacks on the campaign against inequality comes from Nisbet, and particularly from a pamphlet which is called The New Despotism. And it's not the long one, it's some like 34 pages. I think you can find it for free at Mises.org. If you put Robert Nisbet New Despotism, you can find it there. And he says, notice how the state gains more and more power from you by telling you that it is doing it for a right purpose. So, for example, see how the state today has such a say on how you're going to run your business based on things that today would call them diversity. Back then, he calls them something else. But with the idea that we need to have more equality, you give up more and more freedoms, and even more, you cannot even say, why am I doing this? Well, you do it happily because you do it for equality. You do it for a higher purpose. So basically, he says, you've all been suckers because with a supposedly humanitarian aim, you're giving up more and more of your power to the state. And he calls them the quote, the cult of equality. And he says that for them, quote, equalitarianism and central power are but two sides of the same coin. So he makes a very fierce attack to Rawls. He goes back again to Rousseau, and he says that what actually you want and what you've achieved is make the central power stronger and stronger and stronger, which again, it means that you take more and more power away from the communities, from the voluntary organizations that for a long time negotiated the relationship between human beings. Now, how do we evaluate this idea of community as objectivists? But before that, let me see if there's any other super chat. Thank you so much, CJ. I see some good comments about my beard. Bonnie says Clubhouse has some nice voluntary communities. Okay, so that's very important, very interesting. The obvious answer to Nisbet would be that, no, today we have more and more communities because of the internet. The question is, how strong, though, are these communities? And I keep changing my mind on that. So quite often, for example, you see they're very, very strong. Actually, last year, I remember there's a person I know, I'm not that close to that person, but she's something like friend of friends. And we've been around in some similar intellectual circles. Anyway, unfortunately, she faces a health issue, and she had to do an operation in a private hospital. And she needed something like £20,000. So she needed a sum of money which is not negligible. I saw the appeal on social media by friends with a delay of something like 24 hours. So the appeal went out on Monday. Let's say I saw it Tuesday. Tuesday, I go to GoFundMe. It's closed. Why? It had already been superseded. So within 24 hours, friends came together, or people who kind of knew her but didn't know her that well, or people who did know her that well, they came together and they gathered the money. It was so beautiful. But Nisbet says it's not, yeah, you can have these communities, he would probably say, because he's not around anymore, but how meaningful are these relationships? And also he says something else. You also need, he says, some strong assets. So for example, he says, when you don't have a house, or when you don't understand what it means to have hard property, like a car or land, it's easier for the state to take more and more and more and more from you. Again, what was the class that mostly resisted the Bolsheviks? The farmers. Why? He says, because there's this idea that I have roots here. I owe this land. This land is my property. And without this idea, he says, we're more susceptible to the powers that be. Thanks, Eric, for the good, for the kind comments, and also Sam and Christopher. Thank you very, very much. So the final thing is, how do we evaluate the idea of the community? Now, I will give you my experience from Greece. And I will tell you, for example, that the strong family ties in Greece is the best and maybe the worst thing that could happen to a young person. Okay, not the worst thing, but it could be good and bad. Why could it be bad? Because it holds back way too many people. In Greece, for example, it's not unusual for someone to stay with their parents till they're in their 30s or even 40s or whatever. And I can understand why this can be unhealthy. At the same time, though, because of these strong relationships, despite the fact that there's a big state in Greece, why do we have this idea of Greece is very corrupt? It's basically because the power of the state cannot, or it used to be like that, cannot really touch much parts of your life, because you know someone, that someone knows someone else, so you figure things out without going to the state. Or let's say, you know a doctor, so you have a health issue, you don't have to deal with the public health system, or for some of these issues. Or, for example, there's this idea that we're going to figure it out among us, among ourselves. And most importantly, during the financial crisis of 2010, 2018, let's say, these strong ties saved Greece. Not the Greek state, which went bankrupt, but the Greek people. So that's where you see the importance of these communities. Now, again, you shouldn't be tied to a community where you hate everyone else or everyone else hates you. Or if your family values are so completely different from you, maybe you should think that, yeah, I don't need that. I don't need that community. But I totally see what Nisbet says, that when you have these strong, what he calls intermediate institutions, the power of the state is weaker. When these institutions get weakened, the power of the state becomes omnipotent and omnipresent. So I'm not going to give you the party line how to think about the ideas of communities. It's clear how in some ways it's incompatible with an idea of independent judgment, because some of these communities are not chosen, for example, the family or the extended family. But I will just say that having some good connections, let's say, with your extended family, and particularly if you happen to appreciate these people, is something very good, and it gives you a grounding in life that otherwise, and particularly in today's difficult times, you would lack, and it's better to have it rather than not to have it. Okay, so that's it for today. Again, not many people know Nisbet, but I think there's something to it. So I would recommend maybe, again, The New Despotism, which is his attack on the anti-inequality crusade, and also maybe The Quest for Community, where most of the ideas we discussed come from. So what happens later today, 10 p.m. UK time or 5 p.m. Eastern time? We have the Atlas Shrugged versus Fleabag TV series. This is the first episode of the new show with Mark Pellegrino, Jennifer, and Jax, who are the creators of The Strike, the limited series based on Atlas Shrugged. If you followed Mark Pellegrino, he's very excited about this, and we are bringing these people to ARC UK. That's an interactive show with live polls and a clubhouse after show. So it's especially important to watch live because you will get these elements of interaction. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. And we can go to Clubhouse for a while to see if anyone else has read Nisbet, or if you have any opinions about this idea of the community as a defense, and of the intermediary institution as a defense against the state. whether community has the risk of becoming something akin to tribalism. And I'm going to see you there in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.